Let us rejoice and be glad, for this is the day that God has made. Let's stand and sing together.
Rejoice ye pure in heart, hymn number 34. 1, 2,
Good morning. It's a beautiful day. It is the last weekend of summer. And didn't we get lucky? Beautiful. And it's beautiful to be here gathered together to carve out just a short segment of our week to specifically focus on our own spiritual life and the life of the world, and to make that very personal connection with God. So I'm glad you're here to do that. There's a bunch of stuff going on this week, so let me just run down the list. First, I want to say that at our coffee hour today, we're going to be honoring Pastor Judy with a luncheon, and we're all looking forward to that, so make sure you hang around for that. And then tonight at 7 o'clock, the Women's Reflection Group. Tomorrow night is the council meeting, and that council meeting at 7:30 is open to all congregants who want to come and observe that or make a comment. If you'd like to make a comment, just contact Marilyn Clark, and you can do that at the meeting. Thursday is ESL, Friday is Reader's Choice, and I believe the clothing drive for the men is still going on, so feel free to bring your gently used clothing into the church. And the crop walk is being planned, so I don't see Joan here today, but that's in process, and think about signing up for the crop walk. Pardon me? Oh, she's in the kitchen. All right, it doesn't surprise me. So if you want to know more about the crop walk, talk to Joan. I did want to remind you that next Sunday we have an important meeting here at the church. We're going to have a wonderful service with a lot of guest musicians. Speaking of guest musicians, I want to welcome these guys here today. And John, would you like to introduce our players today?
Well, Joe Christensen has been here many times before, and every time he comes, he brings a different combination of brass musicians. So, Joe, why don't you introduce the members of the...
Yeah, we have...
we have over here Billy Hughes on tuba. Yeah. And Kyle Anderson on French horn.
Thank you. And to top it all off, we have George with us this morning. So everybody loves George. So we're going to have a wonderful service next week with a lot of music. And then we're going to go back into the Peace Lounge with our guest, John Janka. And John has been our church consultant for about 5 years. And we'll go back and have some coffee. And then I think Joan, again, has helped put together a luncheon for us. And so from 12 o'clock to 2 o'clock, we're going to have lunch, and we're going to have a working meeting with John Janka. And it's kind of a 5-year checkup, really, for where we were, where we are, and where we want to go as Emmanuel. So it's important that you're there. It's important that our long-term members are there. It's important that our guests and friends are there. It's important that anyone who has any kind of stake in our ministry be there, because we're going to be planning for the next 5 years. Not going to do it all in Sunday, next Sunday. The meeting won't last more than 2 hours, so don't worry, it's not going to drag on and on. But it's important that you be there, so make sure you put that on your calendar. Okay, Pastor Judy.
Let's turn in our hymnal to page 650, where there is a unison reading for us to join together in. On page 650, it's the prayer of St. Francis. So let's join together in reading it. Lord, make me an instrument of thy peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is sadness, joy. O divine Master, grant that I may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive, it is in pardoning that we are pardoned, it is in dying that we are born to eternal life. Amen.
We will now be performing a piece by Johann Sebastian Bach. This is his Sinfonia number 9 in F minor from his 3-part Inventions for keyboard.
Our scripture reading today is taken from the Gospel of John, verses from the fifth chapter. Sometime later, Jesus went up to Jerusalem for a festival of the Jews. Now there is in Jerusalem near the sheep gate a pool, which in Aramaic is called Bethesda, and which is surrounded by 5 covered colonnades. Here a great number of disabled people used to lie, the blind, the lame, the paralyzed. One who was there had been an invalid for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and learned that he had been in this condition for a long time, he asked him, "Do you want to get well?" "Sir," the invalid replied, "I have no one to help me into the pool when the water is stirred. While I am trying to get in, someone else goes down ahead of me." Then Jesus said to him, "Get up, pick up your mat, and walk." At once the man was cured. He picked up his mat and walked. The day on which this took place was the Sabbath, and so the Jews said to the man who had been healed, "It is the Sabbath. The law forbids you to carry your mat." But he replied, "The man who made me well said to me, 'Pick up your mat and walk.'" So they asked him, "Who is this fellow who told you to pick it up and walk?" The man who was healed had no idea who it was, for Jesus had slipped away into the crowd that was there. Later, Jesus found him at the temple and said to him, "See, you are well again. Stop sinning, or something worse may happen to you." The man went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had made him well.
Hymn number 623, Sweet Hour of Prayer. Sweet hour of prayer, sweet hour of prayer, that calls me from
Let me read a brief passage from the book of Romans. For the creation was subjected to futility, not of its own will, but by the will of him who subjected it in hope, because the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to decay and obtain the glorious liberty of the children of God. We know that the whole creation has been groaning in travail until now, and not only the creation, but we ourselves. I was able to go over to the climate action, the climate strike in New York City Saturday, and join tens of thousands of primarily young people who are concerned about the future of our planet. There are some great signs. I like that one about the best. It's a little hard to make out from the distance, but you can see our beloved Statue of Liberty there, holding her torch, and the waters are rising all around her. And our world, we know, is not only being inundated with floods, but our house is on fire. The world is on fire. And it was so inspiring to see these young people who are deadly serious about what's happening and about taking responsibility, about making something happen. So I think of that passage in the book of Isaiah, and a little child shall lead them. And I think many of you saw that little child, that young 16-year-old girl from Sweden on the news this week. She's everywhere, and she is quite a remarkable young woman. And a little child shall lead them. So as people of faith, I think we really need to start to think about what our role is in the stewardship of the earth. We frame it in those terms, the stewardship of the earth. And this text in Romans is so important because it says that the entire creation is groaning for redemption. The earth is crying out. Our Mother Earth is crying out. Do we hear her? Are we listening to our Mother Earth? As people of faith, this is our responsibility. So we'll have some silence, and as we enter together into our silence, I'd like us to try to listen to what our Mother Earth is saying to us today. Our Mother Earth and all of its inhabitants, many of whom who are suffering because of this. Farmers who have been flooded out, climate refugees, tremendous droughts around the world, chronic health problems, all because we haven't taken care of our Mother Earth. So let's listen and see what we can hear today. Are you listening? Are you thinking? This isn't a time to think. When we come to God in prayer and meditation, this isn't a time to be thinking about something. It's a time to be listening. And I know it's very, very difficult for us to discipline our minds because we're so used to paying attention to these thoughts, and we have not practiced listening. So it's a reflex action. When we try to quiet ourselves, we're bombarded with these thoughts, and it takes practice. But let's practice today just for a few moments and listen. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. Our gracious and loving and creative God, we claim your stewardship, your ownership over all the earth. Thank you for the beauty of this day, of this creation, of this air that we breathe, of this grass that we walk in, of these birds that greet us with their songs every morning, of this good water that we drink. Because we know there are so many people on this earth who don't have access to those things. Guide us in your way, the way of followership, of discipleship, the way of Christ, the way of Francis, the way of those children who have such a large vision of life, and teach us to pray. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. Amen. Now for our offering this morning, this is our Commitment Sunday. I know many of you have already offered your annual commitments. We had pledge cards that were mailed out. They looked similar to this. This is not the official pledge card. It's kind of a replica, but we would like to give everyone, instead of passing the plates today, we're not going to pass the plates. We're going to have you come and we're going to have you drop your offering into this plate. So as we have our offertory, ladies, just relax back there in the back. We don't need you today, except if there's someone who is not able to come forward, we'd like one of the ushers to go to you. So if you're not able to come forward, we'll bring the plate to you. Everyone else, beginning here at the front, I'd like you to come and drop your offering into the plate. Something. If you only have this card to drop in, just sign your name and drop it in. It doesn't commit you to doing all of those things, but any one of them. So take a look at that. Maybe you've already dropped your card in. Just sign it. That's all you have to do. Just sign it and drop it in. If you'd like to put an amount on this card, you haven't done that yet, feel free to put a dollar amount, but that's not required. So if you have, whatever you have, your regular offering, your commitment card, whatever it is, feel free to come forward as we enjoy our offertory.
We will be playing the Trio for Brass by Francis Poulenc.
as it flows. And a dream is just a vessel that must follow where it goes. Trying to learn from what's behind you, never knowing what's in store, makes each day a constant battle just to stay between the shores. And I will sail my vessel till the river runs dry, like a bird upon the wind. These waters on my sky, I'll never reach my destination if I never try. So I will sail my vessel until the river runs dry. Too many times we stand aside and let the waters slip away, till what we put off till tomorrow has now become today. So don't you sit upon the shoreline and say you're satisfied. Choose to change the rapids and dare to dance the tide. And I will sail my vessel till the river runs dry, like a bird upon the wind. These waters on my sky, I'll never reach my destination if I never try. So I will sail my vessel until the river runs dry. Well, there's bound to be rough waters, and I know I'll take some falls, but with the good Lord as my captain, I can make it through them all. And I will sail my vessel until the river runs dry, like a bird upon the wind. These waters are my sky, I'll never reach my destination if I never try. So I will sail my vessel until the river runs dry. Yes, I will sail my vessel until the river runs dry. Yes, I will sail my vessel until the river runs dry.
Thank you, George. Playwright and author Thornton Wilder has a one-act play entitled The Angel That Troubled the Waters. It's based on John chapter 5, the story that Pastor Judy read for us earlier. It's the story about a pool in first century Jerusalem which was believed to have had healing properties. Scores of the sick, the crippled, the wounded surrounded the pool, and legend has it that occasionally an angel would descend from heaven and stir the waters. And if one were to enter the water while that water was still churning, they would be healed. But there were so many people, and there was only so much room in the pool, so people waited and waited. Some waited a long, long time. One man, the key character in the story, is said to have waited 38 years for his healing. But Wilder, in his play, adds another character to the story which isn't in the text. He's a physician who's wrestling with grief and depression and waiting for his own healing. He waits and waits for the water to stir. Finally, the angel touches the water. He rushes forward to be the first to enter. But the angel stops him and says, "No, this is not your time." The physician says, "Please, please let me be healed of my depression and my grief. If I were healed, think of all the good that I could do, all the people that I could then go out and heal." And the angel responds, "No, without your wounds, where would your power be? It's your melancholy that makes your low voice tremble into the hearts of men and women. The very angels themselves cannot persuade the wretched and blundering children on earth as can one human broken being, broken on the wheels of living. In love's service, only wounded soldiers can serve." Later, another man who did enter the water and is healed on that same day rejoices in his good fortune, and turning to the physician says, please come with me to my home. It's only an hour away. My son is lost in dark thoughts, and you're the only one who's ever lifted his mood. Then there's my daughter. Since her child died, she sits in the shadow, and she won't listen to anyone but you. Come, please come. In love's service, only wounded soldiers can serve. Today I want to talk to you about wounded soldiers, broken, wounded people who have somehow found a way through their pain and brokenness to their own healing and transformation, and have found how to use their own woundedness as a source of healing and transformation for others. Wilder used John 5 as a backdrop for his play. It is a fascinating story. The pool at Bethesda in Jerusalem, it was said to have had healing properties. In the first century, people believed in all kinds of spirits, all kinds of demons. The world was thick with both. And these spirits made their abode, made their home in certain sacred places. In fact, in every tree, every river, every stream, every pool had a resident spirit. The pool at Bethesda was considered such a sacred place. And we might say, well, that was rather superstitious of these people. But think about it. Whether it be the healing shrine at Lourdes or the healing waters of the Ganges, we still, in our time, believe that certain sacred places have healing properties. So there were those around this sacred healing pool that had waited so long. And the crippled man, the paralytic, was one of those. He'd waited for 38 years. And it's kind of ironic that those who needed the healing the most, the crippled, the paralytic, those who were not able to move quickly, were the ones usually that were the last ones to get into the water. And they had to compete with the healthier and yet infirm people. But that's the way it was. So Jesus shows up on the scene, and Jesus asks one of his most unusual questions. He asked the man, "Do you want to be healed?" Now, what kind of question is that? Been laying there for 38 years. Do you want to be healed? You know, sometimes people can become so accustomed to and even comfortable with their own suffering that they lose sight of the possibility of healing. They lose the hope of healing. They lose the desire for change. We think about some homeless people or people who have been institutionalized in some kind of institution or in a prison, and they get so acclimated to that environment and so hopeless about any chance for freedom and a new life that sometimes they just acquiesce and accept to that reality. It becomes their reality, a miserable but comfortable one in a strange kind of way. And so Jesus asked the question, do you want to be healed? And this man's response is instantaneous. It's unequivocal. Yes, I don't want to live like this. I want to be healed. And then Jesus, in that classic line, then rise, take up your pallet and walk. Now, The traditional sermonic application of this text has to do with faith and the healing power of Christ and about our cooperation with God in actualizing this healing power. God does God's part, we do our part. Rise, take up your pallet. You have to do something, but God will heal you. That's a beautiful truth. But today I want to dig a little deeper into the story. I want to go another level deeper into the story, into the text. I want to go to the very state of brokenness and woundedness and suffering that those people around that pool and that we ourselves all experience. And I want to talk about what can happen when we learn to embrace our brokenness and allow our wounds to become the source of transformation and healing for ourselves and for others. As Wilder asks in his play, without your wounds, dear brother, without your wounds, dear sister, where would your power be? In love's service, only wounded soldiers can serve. You see, just as the wounds of Christ became a healing source and healing power for a broken and wounded world, so our wounds, fully embraced and offered in self-giving love, can become such a gift. The Apostle Paul, who carried his own personal woundedness, reinforced this vital spiritual principle in the book of Corinthians when he said, God's power is perfected in our weakness and woundedness. But this is not easy stuff. First, we have to decide if we want to be healed. As Jesus asked, do you really want to be healed? That means, do you really want to do the deep work that healing requires? Do you really want to embrace your woundedness? Do you really want to get honest with God and with yourself about where the source of your inner pain is, the source of your destructive behavior is? Do you really want to be healed? It's the same question. The life of Christ illustrates that the way out of pain and brokenness is the way through. And for Jesus, the way through was the way of the cross, the way of self-giving love, the way through. And if we, you and I, live in denial of our woundedness, if we paper it over with excuses, if we wear some false veneer of perfectionism, then we'll become cynical and bitter. We'll become victims. And we'll end up blaming other people for who we are. And we'll pass our woundedness and our pain onto the next generation or the next person. You see, either we transform our wounds or we transmit them. It's true. Transformed people transform others. Wounded people wound others. Father Richard Rohr talks about exporting our unresolved hurts to the next generation. This is what's happening in our world. Generation after generation of unresolved hurt, unresolved wounds being transmitted to the next generation, the children, the grandchildren, the great-grandchildren. We either transform those wounds or we transmit them. And when we choose to embrace our brokenness and our wounds, they become what I call sacred wounds. But before we can transform them and let them go, we need to listen to our broken spirits and our broken hearts. We need to learn from them. And then we need to do the deep work that's required for transformation. Many of you know about the group that we started a couple of years ago. It's called Uncoupling. And it's a support group, simply, for people who have gone through a breakup, We used to talk only about divorce recovery and divorce support groups, but now many people have serious, committed, long-lasting relationships, and they're never married. They never intend to be married. Or it can be a 6-month relationship that's very deep and serious. And so we have a support group that meets to help people who are going through those breakups, those heartbreaks. Now listen to that phrase. Heartbreaks, a broken heart. A broken heart. And I call that group that meets on those Thursday nights the Church of the Brokenhearted. But not only the brokenhearted, the church of broken hearts and healed hearts, because many have worked through those very deep and painful emotions. And whether it's an uncoupling support group, whether it's an AA group, whatever the group is, these are people who are authentic, who are very honest about the fact that they've come to a point in their lives where they're broken and where they need help. Authenticity. That's what the world is looking for in a spiritual community. Authenticity. And so often in churches, in religious congregations, people have to paste on this veneer of perfection and goodness. And people can see right through that. One of my favorite folk country singers who died a few years ago, Guy Clark, has a beautiful little song, and in it he says, you and I got holes to fill. Sometimes them holes is all that's real. That's the real stuff. That's the authenticity. That's what I see in those groups like the uncoupling group. And those holes, those wounds, can hold a beautiful secret. But we have to come to the point where we embrace them and we admit that we can no longer fix it. We can no longer control it. We can no longer explain it. We can no longer understand it, what's happening to us, but somehow God is in it. God is in the midst of it, even those most dark and painful times. God is in the midst of those broken-hearted moments. And you know, there are different kinds of brokenheartedness. There's what I call the shattered and scattered brokenheartedness, where our world just falls apart and it's totally disintegrated, and we see nothing good in it and no way out of it. And then there's something that I call the heart broken open. This is different. A heart broken open is like a sealed container that's been broken in half so that God's love can fill that container more fully. Our hearts are broken in such a way that we become more open and vulnerable and receptive to receiving the love of God. It's a beautiful thing to see. It's an even more beautiful thing to experience. Many years ago, I went through my own divorce. And for me, it was a heartache that was shattered and scattered. My entire world, it seemed, had just disintegrated, been blown up. And for me, that heartache was more like somebody just punched a hole in my chest and grabbed my heart and just pulled it out. And it was the most difficult thing I had ever gone through. And I wept a lot. I wept deeply a lot. For a man that does not cry a lot. You know, real men don't cry, do they? I wept, and I wept, and I just cried my eyes out. And so in the middle of that, I decided I needed to do some self-care, so I reserved a space at a Buddhist monastery in Sonoma County on the coast in California for 3 or 4 days. And I drove up this long country road heading to the monastery, and at the gate of the monastery was one of the monks, a very, very unassuming little man. And I pulled up with my car and I said, "Oh, I'm Ken Gill. I've reserved a space here at the monastery this week." And he looked at me and he said to me, he looked deeply into my eyes, and this glow about him, this warm glow. And he looked in my eyes and he said, "Your face is so soft." I'll never forget that. He could see inside my soul. He understood how that pain had broken me open and made me softer, more vulnerable. So I had a broken heart, but God gave me a new heart, a softer heart, a bigger heart, a heart broken open. This is the beautiful possibility if we embrace it. And then some years later, many of you know I was in this horrific motorcycle accident and my body was broken apart. And since then, and as a part of that experience, I ended up in a nursing home for a number of weeks. I'd been in nursing homes many times in my ministry, more times than I can count. But I became a nursing home patient with a bunch of people that were much older and not in very good shape. And I made it out of that nursing home alive. And you know, I never entered a nursing home again to visit one of my congregants in the same way after that. My heart was touched. I saw those people. I saw those facilities in a different way. I felt and empathized more deeply because of what I'd gone through. And that's the way it is, isn't it? When we've gone through something very difficult, a challenge, a heartache, a betrayal, a disappointment, when we've gone through something and embraced it and worked through it, we can more deeply identify with people who are going through the same thing, can't we? Now, maybe we haven't totally worked through it. Maybe there's still kind of a hole in our heart. But just sharing the pain with a person that's gone through a similar thing, that's gone through an addiction, that's lost a child, that's gone bankrupt, just sharing your struggle is such a powerful, powerful thing. And this then is the great spiritual paradox that in our brokenness and woundedness and even our poverty, physical poverty, emotional poverty, we can offer our greatest gifts. You remember last week, for those of you who heard Pastor Lewis, he referenced that story in Acts, the crippled man at the gate, and one of the disciples came by. He was asking for money, and the disciple said, "Silver or gold have I none, but what I have, take, rise, and walk." What I have, you can have. And so maybe on our Commitment Sunday, that's a good thing to remember. We give not out of our abundance all the time, out of our strength. We give out of our poverty, out of our need. And that's the most beautiful gift that God will ever receive, when we give out of our poverty. And that's what Jesus did. That's the core of it. It's very simple. Jesus' greatest gift, his self-giving love that transformed the world, wasn't born out of some big strength or success or victory. It was born out of his suffering and out of his defeat and even his apparent death. And that's the gift. That's the gift that healed the world. And so the prophet said, "By his stripes we are healed." That was the gift. Not by his strengths you are healed, by his stripes you are healed. And so as I close today, I just want to affirm that I know that all of us in our own way have been brokenhearted in little pieces, each of us. You may never share your story with me or anybody else, but I know it's happened to all of us. And thank God for that, because we all suffer from the same limitations and imperfections and brokenness, and that leaves us all more open to receiving the grace of God and receptive to the grace of God, even ministers, especially ministers. You know, a little book that shaped my ministry, was very formative in my ministry, was a little book by Father Henry Nouwen, and it was called The Wounded Healer. Beautiful little book. And in it, he was speaking to priests and clergy and ministers, and he said essentially, it's not how wise you are, how strong, how holy, how perfect, but it's about how vulnerable you can be. And it's about your willingness to see your pain and woundedness as arising from the human condition, a condition which all ministers share in with all people. Some of you may have read the story this week about a former Ridgewood clergy person who's accused of a lurid sexual crime. He no longer lives in Ridgewood. He's been arrested. I don't know if the story is true or not. And quite often, in this case, for many of us, our first reaction is anger, because we know of all the pedophile priests and the clergy, Protestant and Catholic, that have been rightfully accused, and we get angry. But our first reaction should not be anger, it should be humility, because we know that each of us is complicit in our own way in every act of evil. None of us is above reproach totally. Each of us have our flaws and weaknesses. And then the second act should be that of redemption. And I know we think of the victims first, but we think of the perpetrators. Redemption is always the last word in the gospel story. Redemption. You see, the church has a habit of shooting its wounded. Authentic Christian communities don't shoot their wounded. Authentic Christian communities don't kick people while they're down, whether they're lay persons or clergy persons. Redemption is always the last word. Why? Because we're all sinners, saved by the grace of God. Here's the funny thing with Jesus and sinners. Jesus had no problem with sinners. You show me a place where he couldn't relate to a sinner. Jesus had a problem with people who said they weren't. There was the problem. There, but for the grace of God, go I. God is looking for wounded soldiers to serve in his salvation army. Wounded nurses and doctors to serve in her hospital of redemption. Spiritual midwives, broken open by failure and tragedy and betrayal and heartache, who can help give birth and transform others by offering themselves and their own woundedness. Rise and walk, my friends. Our healing and transformation is at hand, and love service only wounded soldiers can serve. Will you join me in a closing hymn today?
Our closing hymn, number 290 in your hymnal, Spirit of God, Descend Upon My Heart, verses 1 and 5.
Go with God and remember God is in you and God is smiling. Take a few moments to greet each other and then come on in and let's celebrate Pastor Judy today.